It didn't change in a year. It didn't change in a decade. It changed slowly, generation after generation. What we consume now wasn't decided by us. It wasn't decided by our parents either. The foundation was laid long before any of us questioned what normal meant. By the time we were old enough to notice, the architecture was already complete. The choices had already been made. The systems were already running. And most of what shaped our plates was invisible, structural, and inherited. This wasn't the result of a single policy or a dramatic shift. It was the accumulation of decades of small adjustments, minor recalibrations, and incremental changes that no single generation fully saw. Each one normalized what the previous one had introduced. Each one accepted what came before as the baseline. And over time, those baselines shifted so far from what food once was that the distance became difficult to measure. In the early 20th century, food was still largely seasonal, regional, and perishable. Distribution was limited. Preservation methods were basic. What you ate was often determined by where you lived and what could be grown or be raised nearby. There was no global supply chain. There was no industrial processing at scale. Meals were shaped by geography, climate, and tradition. And while that system had its own limitations, it also had boundaries. Food couldn't travel far. It couldn't last long. It couldn't be engineered beyond recognition. But that began to change, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The infrastructure for mass production was built piece by piece: refrigeration, rail transport, canning, pasteurization. Each innovation was framed as progress. And in many ways, it was. Food became safer in some respects. It became more accessible. It could reach people who had never had consistent access before. But it also became something else. Something that could be controlled, standardized, and optimized for profit rather than nourishment. By mid-century, the industrialization of food was no longer experimental. It was the system. Factories replaced farms as the primary source of what most people ate. Ingredients were broken down into their chemical components and reassembled in forms that bore little resemblance to their origins. Flavor became something that could be synthesized. Texture became something that could be engineered. Shelf life became the priority. And the result was a food supply that could be produced at unprecedented scale, shipped across continents, and sold at prices that undercut anything made by traditional methods. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The changes were introduced gradually, marketed as improvements, and embedded in everyday life before debate could form. There was no moment when the public was asked to weigh the trade-offs, no referendum on whether food should be optimized for durability over nutrition, no discussion about what would be lost in exchange for what was gained. The transition simply happened. And by the time it was complete, it felt like it had always been this way. Children born into that system had no reference point for what came before. Their parents might have remembered something different, but memory fades. Nostalgia is easy to dismiss. And when every supermarket, every school cafeteria, every restaurant operates within the same framework, the framework becomes invisible. It stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like reality. Most people never noticed this at the time. The shift was too gradual, the messaging too consistent, and the convenience too appealing to resist. But the consequences didn't arrive immediately. They accumulated, quietly, across decades, in ways that were difficult to trace back to any single cause. The human body doesn't respond to systemic change overnight. It adapts, it compensates, it tolerates, until it can't. And by the time patterns became visible, rising rates of metabolic disorders, inflammatory conditions, cognitive decline, behavioral shifts in children, The habits were already entrenched. The infrastructure was already locked in. The economic incentives were already aligned in a direction that made reversal nearly impossible. This wasn't about individual failure. It wasn't about lack of willpower or poor personal choices. Those narratives were convenient for the system because they redirected responsibility away from the structures that shaped those choices in the first place. If the problem is framed as individual, the solution can be marketed as individual too. Another product, another diet, another supplement. But the actual issue was never individual. It was systemic. It was designed, and it was inherited. The real impact appeared years later, not in a single generation, but across several. Children who grew up on processed food became parents who fed their children processed food, not because they didn't care, but because that's what was available, affordable, and normalized. The cycle reinforced itself. Each generation accepted the baseline set by the one before, and with each iteration, the distance from what food once was grew wider. The system wasn't built with malice, it was built with incentives. Incentives to reduce cost, to increase yield, to extend shelf life, to maximize profit margins, to create products that could be produced at scale and sold at volume. And those incentives, over time, reshaped not just food, but the entire relationship between people and what they consumed. Eating stopped being about nourishment. It became about convenience, about price, about branding, about engineered palatability designed to override natural satiety signals. This was structural, it was economic, it was political, it was regulatory, and it was generational. No single person could opt out of it without significant effort, expense, and access to alternatives that most people simply didn't have. The system didn't force anyone to eat poorly. It just made eating poorly the path of least resistance, and it maintained that path across decades through shifts in culture, technology, and public awareness. By the time the consequences became undeniable, the system had already become too large to dismantle. Too many industries depended on it. Too many jobs, too many supply chains, too many political interests. Changing it would require not just individual action, but collective restructuring on a scale that most institutions were unwilling to attempt. So instead, the focus remained on individual responsibility, on education, on awareness campaigns that placed the burden of change on consumers rather than on the structures that shaped their options. But awareness doesn't dismantle infrastructure. Knowing that something is wrong doesn't undo decades of optimization for the wrong outcomes. And personal choice, while meaningful, operates within constraints that were built long before any of us were born. The food system we inherited wasn't inevitable, it was constructed, piece by piece, decision by decision, policy by policy, investment by investment. And the fact that it was constructed means it could have been constructed differently, but it wasn't. And the version we got was the one that prioritized efficiency, scale, and profit over everything else. That pattern shaped more than just food. It shaped how we think about health, how we think about responsibility, how we think about what's normal. It shaped entire industries built around managing the consequences of a system that was never designed for human well-being in the first place. Weight loss, pharmaceuticals, functional medicine, biohacking, all of them responses to a problem that was structural, not personal. The people who built this system aren't villains. They were responding to the incentives of their time, but the system they built outlasted them. It became self-sustaining, and now, generations later, we're still living inside it, still eating what it produces, still passing it on. And this wasn't the only change. Similar decisions followed in medicine, in education, in media, in the design of cities and the structure of work. The same logic that reshaped food, optimize for scale, prioritize efficiency, externalize costs, was applied across every major system that governs modern life. That pattern didn't stop there.